Okay, so where we left off last week, we had just finished, if I'm not mistaken, chapter 3. And we're starting on chapter 4. I got a nod, so this is good. And that's going to be on page 44 is where we're going to be starting. And I want to do a little bit of recap, and I'm going to use a little bit of the information that Fred had read in the beginning, word for word, really. So I want to start by kind of putting this into context where we're at. And that is, I think many of you have probably heard this before, but the first 3 chapters of this book and the doctor's opinion, which used to be a chapter in the first edition, that's actually 4 chapters out of 12 of this book, is to do nothing but learn about step 1, to have all the information you need in order to do step 1. Oh, there's a do. What is the do for step 1? How do you do that? How do you admit you're powerless over alcohol? And what does that actually mean? In my life's unmanageable, quantify unmanageable. I can always point to a lot of other people that have more unmanageable life than me, right? So there's no directions up here is what I'm getting at. These are more of cliff notes, but that is what step 1 states. And I'm going to do this final recap here because we are now in chapter 4, and that means that we're done with step 1. So just a little recap, especially for some of the people that are newer. What do we find in step 1? We know that we got that up here. Okay, the reading of step 1 that's always on these posters. But we find when we start studying this book, because we learn that this is a textbook, right? So we study, learn, and hopefully we take action from what we learn. That's a very important piece, is to take action. You can study this, you can come here and show up to the meetings, you can learn, but taking action is a critically important piece of this. So what did we learn? We learned on page 30, second full paragraph. This is the beginning of the chapter, more about alcoholism. And in that first full paragraph, they give us the directions for step 1. Remember, we heard that we're going to be getting clear-cut directions, precisely how they recovered. Here's the directions. In the second paragraph, it says, we learned. We learned something. We learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we're alcoholic. That word had is a synonym for the word had would be must, right? Something that must be done. So we learned that we must fully concede to our innermost selves that we're alcoholic. That doesn't say anything about being an alcoholic. Same thing that step 1 says about being an alcoholic. But here they're saying we have to fully concede we're an alcoholic. It's very different. Or is it? Well, if the directions are that I have to fully concede that I'm an alcoholic, it's always occurred to me, thinking about this as a newcomer, I have to concede I'm an alcoholic. And notice it doesn't say we accept. I mean, we've probably heard that a lot of times with me. I had to accept that I'm an alcoholic. Bull. The word accept, whenever, and it's in here quite a bit in the first portion of this book, but the word accept is only used when they start talking about the solution. Pay attention to that when you hear the word accept. You always see they accepted the solution. Accept, by definition, is something that we take freely. We will receive freely and willingly. Okay. I never received freely and willingly that I'm an alcoholic. You're an alcoholic. Oh, no. It says we conceded, which is the same as begrudgingly admitting, right? It's not something we want to admit, but it's something that we conceded we had to based on our experience and what we're learning here. So we have to concede that we're an alcoholic. So what does that mean? It means I better know what an alcoholic is. How can I concede? If that's my only direction is to concede I'm an alcoholic, I'm going to need to know what they say an alcoholic is, right? It's that simple. And we found out in these first 4 chapters with the doctor's opinion what an alcoholic is. And I want to take you back now to page 44. This is the reason I know it's the first 3 chapters and the doctor's opinion that cover step 1. We know the directions is we need to learn what an alcoholic is, right? That's the whole point of step 1. If you learn what an alcoholic is, then you are armed with the information to either concede or not concede that I'm an alcoholic. I need to know the information first. So the whole first step is about learning that. So again, I want to make sure we're differentiating that when I say that it's these first 4 chapters, it's not my opinion. First thing it says here is in the preceding chapters. Well, that would be every chapter prior to chapter 4. You have learned something of alcoholism. How about that? Where are you going to learn something about alcoholism? The chapters that precede chapter 4. And then they even get a little bit more specific. They say, of everything that you learn there, we hope we've made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. There it is. If I want to know what an alcoholic is and a non-alcoholic is, where am I going to learn that? Everything prior to chapter 4. Now they drill down on this even further, because this is what we're conceding. Even though you learned a lot about alcoholism, now they're saying we're going to make the distinction. And now they take everything you learned there and they're going to summarize it in just 2 questions to determine whether you're an alcoholic or not. 2 questions. I know AA's got a lot of literature and they're up to, I don't know how many questions in their latest one, 44 or 100 or something. But this is all we learned we needed, right? Is the first portion of this book. That's what they used and that's how they all recovered. So it says here, only 2 questions. Question number 1, based on what we learned. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely. And then it has one word, and this is the key. This is the key between studying and reading something. It's that next word, just 2 letters, or. It does not say and. So they're getting ready to pop us with the second question. But they're saying you only need to answer yes to one. One or the other, not one and the other. Or. Second question is, if when you're drinking, you have little control over the amount you take. Either one of those 2 questions that answer saying you are probably an alcoholic. So that's simple. Now, my thought when I first learned that is, well, if that's all I got to do is answer one of those questions, why the hell do I need to read the first 4 chapters, right? I mean, you just summed it up. Let's just keep with the clip notes and move on, right? The reason being, took me a little while to understand this, but the reason being is, you know what you find? You know what else you learn in those previous chapters? Even though you know that it is when you honestly want to, you can't quit entirely, or when I start drinking, I have little control over the amount I take, what you're going to learn is one thing about both of those questions. And that is another question. And that is why. Why, when I want to stop quitting for good, I can't? Why, when I start drinking, I have little control over the amount I take? Why is that? They answer that in those previous chapters. Why is it important to know that? It's important to know that because when you understand it, and if you can relate to what they're saying in those previous chapters, then they give us a prognosis based on their experience. Based on the fact that I can't quit when I want to, and I can't control the amount I take when I start drinking. They call that, and Fred had brought it up a couple times, they said that what they suffered from was a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. So we know those questions, we'll get into there about the mind and body. But I want to focus in on the first part of that. Seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. So first off, seemingly hopeless. If I did something, I said, man, that is seemingly hopeless. That means that I must have tried everything in my arsenal to solve the problem. Seemed hopeless. Hopeless is defined as no possibility of a solution. I could not find a way out of this. They call it seemingly because we know they recovered. But while they were on their own, it was hopeless. Remember, even Dr. Silkworth told, and we praise Dr. Silkworth, you know, he's like this, they call him a medical saint actually in the book, right? But you know what he gave us? He told Bill what we all needed to learn. You're hopeless. He didn't give Bill any kind of solution. He said, there's no solution. Alcoholics of your type, you're doomed. Can't do anything for you. That's what he gave us. And you know why that's so important? Is because if you do not concede that as being an alcoholic, you can concede to the questions. But if you don't concede that what an alcoholic is, according to these guys, is a hopeless state, left to our own devices, that we are beyond human aid. You don't believe that, you know what you're going to do? Same thing I did. Same thing we read over and over and have read in case studies over here is we're going to keep trying to control it. We're going to keep finding another way that I'll be able to drink like other people. We're going to keep trying. And if you're an alcoholic, we're going to keep failing. And I usually ask this, and I'll ask it again, people less than 6 months, how many of you is this not your first rodeo? First time here, right? How many have done it more than once? How many have done it more than twice? And yet they say, rarely has anyone failed. We're seeing a whole lot. I mean, I failed for 10 years bouncing in and out of AA. I know every which way not to do this. I've learned a whole lot of ways not to do this, right? So what they're saying is you don't need, it was right again, we don't need any further authentication. I don't need to go out there and re-authenticate. Well, they're saying that, so I don't know. Let me go try it. You can if you want. I don't know how many more you got in you. I don't know which one is going to be the one that takes your life. I don't know which one that's going to be. But if you want to keep authenticating it, if you think you still may be able to control it, they tell us in the book, our hats are off to you. We don't say that sarcastically. You need to know whether you're an alcoholic or not. This is not a halfway maybe sort of thing. Learn the information, determine it. And if you are, remember, we're determining two things if we're an alcoholic. One is that we answer yes to either one or both of those questions. But number two is, do I understand that that's a hopeless condition? Have I tried everything? And do I believe that I will never be able to stop on my own or control the amount I take on my own? That's the two pieces. So in knowing that, I want to go to the very end of page 43. Just want to summarize the step one before we move off from it. The last paragraph on page 43 that ends this whole discussion. It says, once more, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink. We learned on page 24 why that is. We have that memory problem. Every once in a while, not all the time, at certain times we're unable to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We won't reflect on the consequences. Maybe we do for a long time, but sooner or later, that's why we pick it up again, because one time comes, we pick it up, we don't even think about the consequences. Hopeless condition. Not only hopeless, but it goes on to say here, except in a few rare cases, neither he nor any other human can provide a defense. Well, of course, if there's a certain time where I'm sober right now, and I've been sober 3 months, whatever it might be, and I have not done any of this work, but I'm sober, right? Get the little chip, sober. And I'm staying sober. So anytime that I start thinking about it, thinking about a drink, maybe go out to eat, and maybe the wife orders something, or you see somebody drink, whatever it might be, and we start getting tempted, what's first thing that happens? The defense of willpower pops up and says, oh no, because of what happened, I quit. I'm not doing it. Although I might want it, I'm not doing it. And they're saying that you can do that if you're an alcoholic for a period of time. But there will come a time, it says there will come a time and place when you're going to drink again because you won't reflect. You're going to be so miserable and thinking about that ease and comfort, and you're going to be thinking about what this is going to do for you. You're not going to think about what it did to you. It happens to every one of us. So if I'm not going to reflect at certain times, and I don't know when that time is, it could be tomorrow, it could be next week, it could be 6 months from now. But if I have no effective mental defense, how would a sponsor have that? Oh, I think he might be thinking about it today. He's going to have that lapse in memory. There's no way. And when they say, well, call me before you drink, if I see nothing wrong with it, I'm not calling you before I drink. I'm just not. I don't see anything wrong with it. Unless I'm looking for a drinking buddy, I have no reason to call you, right? And I know you're one that doesn't want to drink. So that's why that stuff doesn't work. And I don't know where these ideas came from. Well, I do know where they came from. They came from lack of understanding of what's in this book, of what these guys know of alcoholism. So that is the second piece of this, is understanding that we are beyond human aid. Me, anybody else, psychology, psychiatrists, treatment centers, whatever it might be, does not work for the real alcoholic, according to Alcoholics Anonymous, not according to me, according to what we're reading right here. How many of you have been in a treatment center? How many of you have been in a treatment center more than once? 2 of us, 2 out of 3. Didn't work?
No.
Didn't work. Didn't work for me either.
Maybe,
So,
maybe smarter.
So now we get to the last sentence. You know you're an alcoholic, and you know that you're hopeless. Last sentence says, his defense must come from a higher power. Of course, if I'm beyond human aid, if I'm going to get aid for my condition, it has to be aid that is beyond human aid. So that's going to be a higher power. You notice it doesn't use the word God, at least not here, but it is what they refer to it as. But it is a capital H and P, so it has to be a power other than human power. And that ends that whole thing about step 1. They're telling us, boom, you're screwed. You want to summarize step 1 in 2 words? You're screwed. Concede it or not. Just make up your mind. If you're not conceding it, by God, get out there as soon as you can and try some more controlled drinking until you're convinced of it. And see if alcohol might beat you into some state of reasonableness, as they say. So now I'm going to turn us back to page 44 as we finish this, and, one thought is, based on what they just told us, if you're not convinced, another good thing that you could sit down and do is grab a piece of paper and list all the methods that you've tried to quit that have not been successful. And then on the other side, you can list the methods that you haven't tried yet. And then go try them. I mean, I'm not saying it sarcastically. You need to know either I'm hopeless or I'm not. Sitting on the fence, you will not do the rest of this work. It's been proven over and over and over. Because this is a new way of living. This isn't a one-off, we do these things and we're done. This is a whole new way of living. Before we're going to resign ourselves to that, we're going to need to be convinced that there's no other option other than death. And that is an option, by the way. I'm aware of that myself. That does become an option. So you can make that list, and it's another good thing to sit down and understand this last sentence that they say in that first paragraph. So if that be the case, that you answered yes. It says you may be suffering from an illness. An illness is defined by the dictionary as a condition that prevents the normal functioning of the mind and or body, as Fred had said. That is the condition we have. You may be suffering from an illness, and according to the authors, says which only a spiritual experience will conquer. That's their experience. Only a spiritual experience. Nothing else have they found to conquer this other than a spiritual experience. So if you're sitting here now, and you may have been here from the beginning, or maybe not, but have learned about alcoholism here and what an alcoholic is, at this point, if you understand that you're hopeless, then really, if you think about it, if you're not interested in a spiritual experience, you might as well leave, because that's what we're going to teach you how to have. That's the only solution Alcoholics Anonymous has. I could sugarcoat it, but I'm not. I'm going to tell you exactly what they said. Only a spiritual experience can conquer this. So spiritual experience, where does that come from? That might kind of tie in somehow with that word higher power, spiritual experience. It's not something you're going to go to Walmart to get, or Amazon or something like that. That's not where we get spiritual experience. It's something we're going to have to work for, and it has something to do with the power greater than ourselves. However, the goal in Alcoholics Anonymous, I go back to, we've talked about this before, is not to get sober. Sober is defined as not drunk, and that's it. What we're looking for is what they talk about in the last one here. It says having had a spiritual awakening, means the same thing as spiritual experience. You can read that in 567. They say it means the same thing. Having had it, at step 12, you don't have it. Notice that having had, you already had it by the time you get to step 12, right? That's our goal, is to have a spiritual experience, because when you have a spiritual experience, you know what happens? You recover. You become recovered. What does that mean? Well, we know recovered means to be returned to a normal state of health after an illness, as Fred had pointed out. What are we recovering? What is it that we're recovering? It says our health. What health? We got a condition of the mind and the body. We learn that the crux of our problem is the mind. You don't pick up the first one, you don't have to worry about the allergic reaction of drinking more than you intend to. First one, my mental defense. That's the crux, the mind. They call that, if you remember, our inability to recall the consequences at certain times. They call that, it says, that is just plain, whatever the precise definition of the word may be, we call this plain insanity. That's insanity. Sanity is defined as wholeness of mind. Insanity is a mind that is not whole. Sanity is defined as wholeness of mind, and insanity is a mind that is not whole. Might be 99.5% whole with everything else in the world, but when it comes to this alcohol deal, something's just a little off. Why you keep picking it up with everything you got to lose? They call that insanity. When we're recovered, we recover our sanity. When you get time, you can look at the bottom of page 84 and on to 85, and it tells us, so by this time, halfway through step 9, sanity will have returned. It actually gets returned. That's what happens when we have a spiritual experience. You understand how that kind of goes together a little bit? So when we read in step 2 up here, it says, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. You ever sit at AA meetings, say, let's talk about step 2. You know what 99% of that discussion is? I had to get my own conception of God. And that is true. But that is only part of what this says. Not only do I need to get my own conception of God, but that conception is going to need to have one qualification. that it has the power to restore my sanity. So when people say, well, this coffee cup right now, I don't believe in God, but this coffee cup will be my higher power. Does that coffee cup make sense to you that it can restore your sanity? Because it doesn't. You'll hear people say, well, the groups, you people, you're my higher power. We're beyond human aid. And if we already understand the mental condition, let alone one sponsor, how are any of you going to know to call me or stop me from picking up the drink at that one time where I have that mental blank spot and I see nothing wrong with it? It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. You don't have the power to restore my sanity. It has to come from a higher power, and that's what step 2 is about. That's what we're getting into. So at this point, as I said, I think that it's most instructive to understand that they're saying the only solution that AA knows and has to offer is a spiritual experience. So if you're not interested in it, you might as well not move on with this, because that's what we're going to learn how to do, is to have a spiritual experience. How to recover means the same thing. That's what we're going to learn here. And it's also a good time, I guess, as you're summarizing this, to answer those 2 questions, to get yourself alone and look yourself in the mirror. A little alone time, look yourself in the mirror and say, I have a condition that prevents the normal functioning of my mind and my body. What am I willing to do about it? Because that's the second piece of this. Even if you concede those things, what are you willing to do about it? Are you willing? We've learned this before. Are you willing to go to any lengths to get over that? Because that is a qualification as well. Anything short of I'm willing to do anything, anything short of that, according to the book, and my experience backs up that book with working with other people, it's not going to work. They stick around for a little while and then they leave. And maybe they get the seed planted and they go out and, we talk about slips or relapses. But I always go back to this book says that this illness is a deadly illness. It's a fatal illness, right? Deadly, fatal. You go back out and drink, that's an attempted suicide. Now, if you make it back or you don't die, it's just a failed attempt. That's not a slip. Do you accidentally fall? Whoops, it accidentally went in my mouth. Anybody have that happen when they did their relapse? No, it's an attempted suicide. So with that, we're going to start talking about step 2. I'll ask for questions later about step 1 if we have any more, but I think that kind of summarizes where we're at here. So let's get on to the second paragraph here, because now what are we going to be looking for? This whole chapter is about step 2, and that's it. It's the only thing we're going to be covering in this chapter is step 2, is getting this conception of God that can restore my sanity. Does that make sense? All right. So to one who feels he is an atheist or agnostic, such an experience, the spiritual experience, seems impossible. But to continue as he is, that means disaster, especially if he is an alcoholic of that hopeless variety. So to be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. Goes back to, are you willing to do anything? You remember Bill's story? Remember when he sat down with Evie and he just got out of the hospital for the 3rd time? And the doctor, Silkworth, told him, you're hopeless. You're going to go home and die. Don't come back here. We don't have anything else we can offer you. Right? So he knew he was hopeless. And then this drinking buddy, Evie, came over to his house. And Evie wasn't drinking. He was sober. And not only that, but just by looking at him, he saw he was completely different. When he opened his mouth, he said his roots grasped new soil. He knew something happened to Evie. He didn't know what. He liked it. He even wanted it. And what's the first thing he said? What happened? What happened, Evie? What happened to you? And what did Evie say? I got religion. And what did Bill say? Bill said, my mind snapped shut on that idea. He didn't want nothing to do with that because of his upbringing and his ideas of God. There ain't no way. Obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice just shut that right down. I'm done. And then we watched for a page and a half of his story as he kept going back and forth. I don't like it. I don't want anything to do with it. But I'm going to die otherwise. I'm told nothing else is going to work. And I'm looking at this guy. He says, I'm looking at a miracle sitting right across from me. I know this guy. He drank worse than me. I always thought I'm an alcoholic if I drank like him. And look at him. He has no more power in him than I have in me right now. What happened to him? And I asked him, he's got religion. God, I hate that idea. He hated that idea. And how did that all get resolved after? They don't go into saying how long, but I imagine that they argued about that for quite a while because I spent a page and a half talking about it. And then Ebby came up with one novel idea. He said, Bill, because remember, he said, I got religion. We know A is not religion, right? You got religion. And he said, Bill, why don't you just get your own conception of God? Didn't know I could do that. Get my own conception. I may have a problem with all I've learned about God and religion and stuff, I'm sure is what's going through Bill's mind, but my own conception? Well, how many of you have a problem with your own conception of anything? I ain't got no problem with my conception of anything, as long as it's my conception. So get your own conception. And that is the day that religion went out of AA, before there was an AA. You can get your own conception. And that's what Bill got. And we watched how that unraveled just by getting his own conception. So that's where we're at. It says, but it isn't so difficult, right? About half of our original fellowship were exactly of that type. So the authors were more than 100 men and women. Over half of them were either atheists or agnostic. Bill was an agnostic. This is a good time to kind of summarize for some of you that may not completely understand the difference between an atheist and an agnostic. I mean, really, there's three forms of belief. You're either a believer, or you're an agnostic, or you're an atheist. I think we all got an idea what a believer is. They have their own conception of God that they believe is there, is true, is real, period. No question. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the atheist. Believes 100% it's true. It's 100% certainty there is no God, period. And then you got the ones in the middle that are the agnostic. And I always thought agnostic meant somebody who does not believe in God. And that's not true. Agnostic goes back to, I forget if it was Greek or whatever, but it's made up of two old words, agnostic. Gnostic means knowledge. You put ag in front of it, it means without. So an agnostic is somebody without knowledge. So what does that mean? We saw it very thoroughly with Bill, and we're going to see it more and hear what an agnostic is, because it seems that they point out that the vast majority of people who come to AA that have a problem with the God idea, the vast majority of them are agnostic, not atheists. Most of them are. So what that means is, and that's where I was when I got here, is I could have wordy arguments with people of religion and really have my points down and just really, and I would argue and argue and argue, you know. But here's what it comes down to. When I do look at night at the stars, when I do look at the beauty of nature, certain times when all the clamor in my mind is gone, it looks like, really, there's no intelligence behind this whatsoever. It's got to be something. Kind of makes sense. From a scientific level, it makes sense that there's something there. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's Jesus or Muhammad. I don't know what it is, but it makes sense or something. But the without knowledge means I don't have knowledge of it. In other words, you'll hear a lot of believers say, I know there's a God. He came into my life and he changed me, or he did this, and man, I experienced it. I have the knowledge. I didn't have that. I just got what kind of makes sense that there's probably something. I don't know what it is. Can't believe in it completely. Just makes sense, but don't know for sure. That's an agnostic. And I'm going to talk a whole lot about the agnostic. So does that make sense? What we're talking about? Okay, so about half of our original fellowship was exactly that type. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. Because if we're true alcoholics, it means we're hopeless. And if we're hopeless, we've already learned we're going to need a higher power. So we're hoping against hope that we don't have to go down that path, right? But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. Perhaps it's going to be that way with you, but cheer up, something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics, but our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. If a mere code of morals or better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. But we found that such codes or philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. Getting into talking a little bit about the believers who've learned, you know, this way of life they're trying to follow. And even though they're claiming to be trying to follow it, that code or philosophy of life, it didn't save them. That didn't work. The dogma didn't work for them. So we're not talking about that. It says we could wish to be moral and we could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power was not there. So the wishing method and the willing method didn't work for them. Our human resources, as marshaled by our will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. And they're not talking about a cow when they say that. That means completely, utterly failed. To underline this, because this really summarizes step one going to step two. Lack of power. That was our dilemma. Powerless over alcohol. That is our dilemma. So we had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves. We're beyond human aid, obviously. But how were we to find this power? How are we to find this power? Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object, I would underline this, the main object of this book is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. The main purpose of the book is not so that you can find a sponsor who you can call on to tell you how to deal with your personal relationships and your finances or anything else that goes on in your life. The main purpose of this book is for you to find a power greater than you, which will solve your problem. Right? I'm recovered. My life is really good. But left to my own devices, my life is very uneven. I can't manage my own life. I had to find a higher power to show me what he wants me to do, and my life became manageable. But left to my devices, my life is unmanageable. What would make you think that I could lead yours? I can't lead my own. Makes no sense. Right? So that means that we've written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. And it means, of course, that we're going to talk about God. Now, there's the word. Here, difficulty arises with agnostics. Many times we talk to a new man and watch his hope rise, just like what happened with Bill. And we discuss his alcoholic problems and explain our fellowship, but his face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God. For we have reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored. We know how he feels. We have shared his honest doubt and prejudice. I don't have this one memorized, and I don't know why, but I have to look this one back up all the time. The word prejudice, by definition, is an adverse opinion or leaning formed without just grounds or without sufficient knowledge. Don't want to hear about it. I think somebody brought that up last week. It was either here at a Tuesday meeting about another quote that's in this book saying one bar that keeps a man in everlasting ignorance is, how does it go? Contempt prior to investigation. Herbert Spencer. Contempt prior to investigation. I don't want to hear about it. I'm not going to investigate. I have got an adverse opinion without just grounds. Possibly, I'm not going to hear your grounds. And without sufficient knowledge, I don't want to hear about it. So that's what a prejudice is. It's forming an opinion without even knowing about it. Some of us have been violently anti-religious. To others, the word God brought up a particular idea in him with which someone had tried to impress on them during childhood. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. And with that rejection, we imagined we'd had abandoned the God idea entirely. We thought that what we learned about God is you accept it all or nothing. And if I fail at some point, that's it. You know, for me, 12 years old, I knew I was going to hell and it was over. You know, I knew some of the things I was doing, I ain't supposed to be doing, I'm going to go to hell for. So that was it. God idea out the window. It was about that simple. We were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak or even cowardly. We looked upon this world of warring individuals, warring theological systems, and inexplicable calamity with deep skepticism. We looked askance at many individuals who claimed to be godly. How could a supreme being have anything to do with it all? And who could comprehend a supreme being anyway? Yet in other moments, We found ourselves thinking when enchanted by a starlit night, who then made all this? There was a feeling of awe and wonder, but it was fleeting and soon lost. Yes, we have agnostic temperament, have had these thoughts and experiences, and let us make haste to reassure you. We found that as soon as we were able to, one, lay aside that prejudice, this is the way I feel, but let me hear what you got to say and get some more knowledge, right? Let me just, can you be open-minded? You can just lay aside that prejudice. And two, even express a willingness to believe in a power greater than yourself. We commence to get results. Doesn't even say you have to believe. A lot of people believe that's what it says in step 2, but it doesn't. It says came to believe, right? You got to come to that point. It didn't, for me, it did not start in believing. I could never make that jump from not believing to believing. The best that it could come out to is this. Here's my mentor. Not, but if he was sitting next to me, if this was my mentor, and just like Bill and Ebby sat down, and he says that his life has completely changed, and if you're interested, I'll show you what I did. And it has to do with God. I might not like the idea of God, but you claim that God is what did this to you. Am I willing to try what you did? Or am I just going to say, nope, there is no God, and I'm just going to have to ignore the miracle in front of me, and that's BS? Or am I going to look at that and say, am I willing to do what you did and see what I get? That's how it was presented to me. You be the judge. Do the work, and if you don't get what we got, then this is all BS, and you're doomed to die, according to the book. Right? Are you willing? Or are you just so anti-religious God idea that I ain't going to hear a thing? And it tells us later that then, you're going to have to find your own solution. And alcohol may have to beat you back into a state of reasonableness or die. It's that simple with us. It's that simple. So we commence to get results as soon as we express that willingness and we lay aside our prejudice, even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend the power which is God. Much to our relief, would underline, we discovered we did not have to consider another's conception of God. We didn't have to consider it. Sometimes you might hear somebody in AA say, well, I'll loan you my God. You can have my God. There's plenty of them to go around. I don't need to consider your conception. I can get my own conception of God. I can get my very own conception. We don't need to have that. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and to effect a contact with him, capital H. As soon as we admitted the possible existence, not even admitted the existence, possible existence. You said God did this for you? I guess maybe, because I don't know what else could have done it. So maybe. If you admit there's a possible existence of a creative intelligence, a spirit of the universe, underlying the totality of things, we began to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. So this is a step that's going to start giving us a new sense of power and direction. We found that God does not make too hard terms to those who seek him. It's an important caveat right in that sentence right there. Who does the seeking? Is God seeking us? It says here that when we do the seeking, he doesn't make too hard of terms. To us, the realm of the spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek. It is open, we believe, to all men. When therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. This applies too to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean. At the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth, to affect our first conscious relation with God as we understood him. At the start, this is all we needed. That is a requirement. We're going to need something to get started. Afterwards, we found ourselves accepting, oh, there's that word, correlates with solution. After that, we found ourselves accepting many things which seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth. But if we wish to grow, we had to begin somewhere. So we used our own conception, however limited it was. Here are the directions for step 2. Step 1 was just a question, right? Am I an alcoholic? I can see it. Step 2, it's just a question. we needed to ask ourselves about one short question. Do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself? That's it. Do you believe, or are you willing to believe? So how do you become, what is willing to believe? How do I know if I'm willing to believe? Are you willing to do what I did and judge the results? That's it. As soon as a man can say yes, that he does believe or is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him he is on his way. It has been repeatedly proven among us that upon the simple cornerstone, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. We're going to learn a lot about building in this. Now, Bill wasn't a builder, but there's going to be a lot of terms that we see, keystone and things like that. Here they're talking about a cornerstone. A cornerstone is the very first stone that gets put in place for a foundation to be built on. And they're saying that this cornerstone is based on this idea. If you just simply are willing to believe, that's all you need, and you will have the cornerstone put in place that we are going to build an effective spiritual structure. Starts there. That was the great news for us, for we had assumed we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith, which seemed difficult to believe. When people presented us with spiritual approaches, how frequently did we all say, I wish I had what that man has. I'm sure it would work if I could only believe as he believes. But I cannot accept as surely true the many articles of faith which are so plain to him. So it was comforting to learn that we could commence at a similar level. The first time I read that, I remember, I don't know how old I was, but I remember seeing something on TV about this woman back when I lived in Detroit. It's on the news. There were a lot of shootings in Detroit, but this one in particular, this woman lost her son. You know, she was probably 40-some years old, and just lost her son. That day was shot in a gang shooting. And the reporter says, well, you know, what kind of justice do you think we need to get? Something along those lines, you know, when they catch him. I am a person of faith, and I forgive him. But who would say that? I would want to shred him, right? And maybe she wanted to shred him, but obviously she has something. I just remember it hitting me. That woman has something that I don't have. Okay. And I may not like what she's saying because I don't feel the same way. But I tell you what, if it was me, just based on my response to what happened to your kid, I'm pissed. And when I'm angry, resentment's number one offender. That kills more of us than anything. She's not. She's got some form of peace. I believe she truly meant that she forgave this person because she had to. And that related this to me. I could not. How do you get from where I am to there? I have no idea. Right. So it says here we can commence at a much simpler level. Besides the seeming inability to accept much on faith, we found ourselves often handicapped by obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. I'm going to finish this paragraph, but with that sentence, I would highlight and underline that because I believe I've mentioned this before. This is the only place that I see in this book when they say, rarely does anyone fail, just thoroughly follow what they did, and it's just going to be peachy, right? This is the only obstacle that I see in this book, where they say, you don't get this, you're not going to be able to get anywhere. And it says that we're handicapped. This is what's going to handicap us. Obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. We call that the OSUPs, O-S-U-P, obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. If you're not open to the idea of learning what we've done, because it's got something to do with God and your mind snaps shut and that's where you want to be, you will be handicapped. It says many of us have been so touchy that even casual reference to spiritual things made us bristle with antagonism. Underline, this sort of thinking had to be abandoned. That's a must. That is a requirement. This sort of thinking must be abandoned. Though some of us resisted, we found no great difficulty in casting aside such feelings. Why? Because faced with alcoholic destruction, we soon became as open-minded on spiritual matters as we tried to be on other questions. So in this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Are you beat into a state of reasonableness? That's really the question to get over this obstacle today. Sometimes this was a tedious process. We hope no one else will be prejudiced for as long as some of us were. And with that, we are going to stop